Welcome to another leadership lesson from the Mahabharata. We've spoken about the patriarchs, and now we're moving to this epic's most enigmatic strategist, Shakuni. We've perceived him to be a villain, but what is he more than that? Shakuni is actually a masterclass in soft power, narrative control, and asymmetric warfare. In today's corporate landscape, his life offers profound warnings on psychological safety and the long term impact of a leader's internal why. Drawing from the BORI critical edition, as translated by Mr. Bibek Debroy, we must ask, was Shakuni an evil villain or a misunderstood genius? And that's the core of today's topic, which will be decoded by our favorite Commander Girish Konkar sir, who's a leadership catalyst. Hello, sir.
Hi,
So, my
good evening.
first question to you, sir, today is it's a bizarre image, a reigning king walking away from his own golden throne to live in the guest quarters of his rivals. Why would a master strategist like Shakuni choose to become a permanent shadow in Hastinapur instead of ruling in his own kingdom?
Okay, great. So the question is, was he a master strategist or was he the villain of the piece? And let's decode it. Now, what if I told you that the most successful winner in the Mahabharata, a man who won an entire empire without picking up a single weapon, is the very man who led his entire family to the graveyard? Today, we are not just talking about a villain, we are talking about the danger of brilliance without a soul. Like you also mentioned earlier, is Shakuni just a villain or a master of asymmetric strategy? In the Mahabharata, Shakuni makes a startling choice. He abandons his throne in Gandhar to live permanently in the guest rooms of Hastinapur. He wasn't there to enjoy the luxury. He was there to observe. While the Kuru princes practiced with spears and bows and arrows, Shakuni refined a deadlier skill: psychological observation. He became the loving uncle, a permanent shadow, hunting for invisible cracks in the Kuru foundation. Every whisper into Duryodhan's ear was a seed of doubt. He didn't serve the dynasty, he engineered its collapse. He played a game of patience spanning decades, waiting for a simple family grudge to ripen into a world-swallowing war. But even critics must acknowledge a remarkable leadership feat here. For 30 years, Shakuni was an absentee king. Back in Gandhar, his brothers and son held the fort. In royal history, spanning over centuries and millennia, such a long absence is an open invitation for a coup. Yet, there was no revolt. And when the call for war came, the entire Gandhar clan marched to Kurukshetra to die for a cause that wasn't even theirs. And this speaks volumes about Shakuni's internal leadership. He built a foundation of loyalty so resilient, it didn't crumble in his absence. And what is called as the shadow mission is mirrored in the modern world. And some examples we can quote here is like when Steve Jobs was ousted from Apple in 1985 by John Scully, the man he hired, it was public humiliation. For years, Jobs carried a Gandhar-style resentment. When he founded Next, part of his drive was pure revenge to prove that Apple was wrong. And they brought him back in 1997. He systematically dismantled the old guard, much like Shakuni disbanding the Kuru elders. However, Jobs eventually succeeded because he shifted his why from proving them wrong, that is, elders wrong, that is his revenge, to making things great, that is, creation. Had he stayed in the Shakuni mindset of pure resentment, Apple would never have seen the iPhone. As a leader, we must audit our own Gandhar. Ask yourself, if I were absent for a year, would my team remain efficient and committed? Or have I failed building a culture that survives without my constant intervention and needling? Real power doesn't just dominate the room, it endures when you leave it. My question to you is, are you leading for a legacy of creation, or are you secretly on a shadow mission fueled by your past?
I think this is a very pertinent question that a lot of corporate leaders definitely face. And sir, in all of this, you've highlighted a very real corporate nightmare. The confidant, every leader almost has that one confidant. But what if this confidant bypasses the system because they have the leaders here? How can an organization distinguish between a soft power collaborator who's getting things done and still looking out for the bigger purpose, the bigger good of the organization, and a Shakuni style infiltrator who is quietly dismantling the culture and everything you work for?
Yeah, so this takes us to the Rajasuya Yajna, which was done by the Pandavas, and they had amassed a great amount of riches after that. And Duryodhan, seeing all those riches, was literally shattered, not by swords, but by the illusions that he saw of grandeur, and especially in the Maya Sabha. If the viewers might remember that he had lost his way and mistaking water for floor and doors for walls in that Maya Sabha. Now, during the entire episode, while the elders followed whatever formal protocols were required, Bhishma and Dronacharya, etc., Shakuni followed the man. He didn't need a divine weapon. He just needed to be in the private quarters when Duryodhan was alone and at his most vulnerable. He simply asked Duryodhan, because Duryodhan was grieving, he was envy, he was jealous. He says, why are you grieving? And this opened the floodgates of resentment from Duryodhan. And Duryodhan said, we must go to war now. I can't stand the Pandavas getting so rich, etc. And when Duryodhan demanded war, Shakuni pivoted to this asymmetric warfare. He knew the Pandavas couldn't be defeated by force. They were already very powerful. And so he targeted a psychological blind spot. Yudhishthir's weakness for dice. That was known. He was not a great dice player, but he thought himself to be a great dice player. And Shakuni then played the ultimate game of soft power infiltration. He manipulated the king Dhritarashtra by framing a high stakes conspiracy as a friendly family assembly to cure his son's depression. So they go to him, he takes Duryodhan with him, and they plead with Duryodhan, with Dhritarashtra, say, look at your son. He's so sad. He's in a lot of depression. And one way is, let's have a friendly game of dice with the Pandavas, which are making him so depressed. So Dhritarashtra agrees to that, and they invite the Pandavas. And therefore, by moving the battlefield from the army ranks to the private chambers, he ensured that the elders, that is Bhishma and Dron, had zero control. This is a masterclass in information asymmetry. Probably in modern boardrooms, the person who has the most private time with the CEO often wields more power than those with the most resources. Now, they say proximity is power. And we see this Shakuni dynamic in the downfall of many high-profile startups, where a founder's confidant, someone with no official C-suite title, bypasses all governance simply because they have the ear of the leader. One startling example was the National Stock Exchange scam. If you remember, the former CEO, Chitra Ramakrishna, reportedly took crucial business decisions based on the advice of a mysterious Himalayan yogi over email. The shadow governance operated entirely outside the organizational chart. bypassing every checks and balances. And when a leader allows a confidant to override official protocols, the circle of trust collapses. Employees quickly realize that who you know and what is more important than what you do, leading to a toxic culture where the system is gamed rather than grown. Influence is a high stakes tool, whether it builds a Taj Mahal or a graveyard. It depends entirely on your intent. What is your purpose? Am I building my current organization to create a legacy, or am I secretly on a shadow mission to prove a past rival or a former boss wrong? Shakuni was an intellectual genius, but an emotional slave, letting old grudges dictate his strategy. Brilliant leaders often get what is called as narrative hijacked by past failures, reacting to the weather instead of creating it. So, in my transformational leadership and emotional intelligence intervention, we focus on the strategic self mastery and
Hmm.
identifying such shadow missions and hidden biases. And these are all hidden subconsciously. I train the team in objective listening to stop unseen narratives before they become crisis. My advice is don't let your past dictate your future. Make choices, master your internal state of being.
So wonderfully said. I don't think we could have, mentioned this in a better way. To all of our viewers right now, we go live every Thursday. So we'd urge you to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. So every time we go live, you can start seeing us and be there with us on this journey. So coming back to Shakuni, many leaders feel that they are losing because their competitors have more firepower, and that could mean anything. They have more capital, they have bigger team, they have better tech, better resources. But from what I gather from what you're saying, that Shakuni's genius was in making his opponent's strengths completely irrelevant. How can a leader identify when they are playing a losing game? And more importantly, how do they move the battlefield to a space where they actually have the advantage?
Shakuni is the ultimate embodiment of what is called by Stephen Covey, the legendary leadership guru, as the scarcity mentality. The toxic belief that for me to win, you must lose. He played a classic win lose game that inevitably spiraled into a lose lose massacre, literally a massacre at Kurukshetra. Shakuni's brilliance lay in his refusal to play a losing game without, but he didn't know it. He looked at the Pandavas, men of unmatched physical prowess, and realized that the Kauravas could never win a fair war of muscle and steel. So he did something revolutionary. He moved the battlefield. He shifted the conflict from the plains of Kurukshetra to the Sabha, that is the assembly hall, and from the sword, the Aksha, that is the dice. This was total asymmetric warfare. And we are seeing this now today with our neighbors, and when we also fight. How can you leverage your strengths and nullify the enemy's strengths? Shakuni didn't try to match the Pandav's strength. He exploited this psychological blind spots. He knew Yudhishthir was bound by a rigid code of dharma that forbade him from refusing given to him. And by changing the rules of engagement, Shakuni rendered Bhima's mace, Arjun's bows completely irrelevant. And he won an empire without spilling a single drop of blood, at least not yet. In the modern Indian context, this is the ultimate lesson in what one can call as disruptive innovation. And think of the Indian telecom sector before 2016. We had giants like Airtel and Vodafone. They were competing for what is called as hard power, network scale, and call rates. And then comes Reliance Jio. Jio didn't try to beat them at their own game. Instead, Jio moved the battlefield from voice calls to data by exploiting some loopholes. By making voice calls free and data incredibly cheap, They exploited the legacy players' reliance on voice revenue. Much like Shakuni's dice game, the competitors' massive existing infrastructure, their bows and arrows, suddenly became their biggest liability. Shakuni was a master of the endgame thinking, but his end was destruction. I would suggest as a leader, we must identify the dice game in our industry. That unique niche where our talent makes the competitor's size irrelevant. However, a caveat here is your disruption must be based on principles. Disrupt to create value, not to settle a score. Shakuni did exactly that. He wanted to settle a score. The Pandavas were prepared for a war of weapons. Shakuni gave them a war of wits. Most leaders fail today not because they aren't strong enough, but because they are bringing bows and arrows to a dice game. Question for you, the viewers. Am I struggling because I'm fighting on my competitor's term? Where is my dice game? The niche where my unique talent makes the opponent's size irrelevant.
Uh, Sir, I think this is something they should really ponder on because you never know what your weakness is and what your dice game might be. So it's better to figure it out early on. And we often hear in boardrooms that as long as we are compliant, we are safe. But you've pointed out that Shakuni thrived precisely because he stayed within the letter of the law while shredding its spirit. Can you take a moment to explain how institutional rigidity mirrors this Kuru style of silence and why following the rules isn't always the same as doing what is right?
So Shakuni's most dangerous tactic wasn't his dice. It was his mastery of the organizational blind spots. He identified that the Kuru elders, that is Bhishma and Drona, had become prisoners of their own rules. He had figured out Bhishma completely. Bhishma was bound by a rigid oath to the throne, and Drona by his so-called, what you can call as that namak to the king. Shakuni realized he didn't need to fight these titans. He simply operated within the letter of the law. And since the king had permitted the game and technical rules were followed, the elders felt they had no legal standing to intervene. Shakuni weaponized their integrity against them. By staying within the technical compliance, he shredded moral ethics. He turned their greatest strength, discipline, and commitment into a fatal weakness, forcing the very people who should have stopped the disaster to watch it happen. And this is a masterclass in institutional rigidity. Look at Satyam Computers, the scandal which took place, I think, in 2006 or so. On paper, Satyam was a paragon of success, governed by a blue ribbon board of world class experts. Everything was compliant, but the Shakuni style manipulation happened in the gap between the rules and reality. The board, much like Bhishma, was so focused on technical reports and the way things have always been done that they missed the ethical rot right under their nose. They followed the protocols but missed the purpose. They stayed silent because they're looking at more at technical balance sheets. In Indian corporates, you often see legacy leaders who refuse to challenge toxic behavior because the promoter has been good to us or it's not against policy. A leader must lead by principles and not just by a to-do list. Bhishma placed his internal oath above the universal dharma. As a modern leader, our takeaway is very clear. Don't mistake compliance for ethics. Compliance is checking boxes. Ethics is doing what is right when the rules are silent. If your oath to legacy prevents you from stopping a disaster, you aren't being loyal. You are an accomplice. Another example is the ILNFS collapse. Perhaps the ultimate Indian example of the Shakuni-style complexity, masking ethical rot which would happen that time. For decades, not 1 or 2 years, decades, ILNFS was the crown jewel of infrastructure finance. Its board, a who's who of the financial establishment, the Bhishmas and drones of our time. However, the management created a labyrinth of over 300 subsidiaries. And this wasn't the structure that they made, it was asymmetric information warfare. And much like Shakuni using the letter of the law, they used the complexity of all these subsidiaries to hide the debt, mounting debt, moving money between subsidiaries to keep reports looking healthy while the core was hollow. The board, blinded by an A plus rating and the too big to fail tag, deferred to the expert management that was there. And they mistook process for control. When the default hit in 2018, it shattered the economy. Their refusal to challenge the narrative turned them into silent accomplices. Ask yourself, who has my ear right now? Is it a Vidur who tells me the uncomfortable truth, or is it a Shakuni who simply validates my insecurities? That's a very difficult one to have. If your purpose is clear, if your values are clear, you can then find out these blind spots. Because one Shakuni can dismantle an entire dynasty by exploiting his blind spot. Is your organization built to survive a manipulator, or is it an accidental accomplice? While most training focuses on how to win, my work is about how to endure. Now, I help the CEOs move beyond that mere compliance to build a values-driven ecosystem, a purpose, values, mission ecosystem, and a code of conduct. We identify the rigidity that paralyzes your Bhishmas and replace it with a culture of radical transparency. It's time to move your team from a win-lose scarcity mindset into a scalable powerhouse that no dice game can touch.
Amazing, sir. Um, Sir, I want to ask you a question that is very important in today's world. We talk a lot about how everything is data driven, and so our leaders also need to be data driven. Every decision should be made based on what the data reflects. But Shakuni has shown us, and you have highlighted it, that he did not care about the facts of a situation. All he cared about was how he could frame them. So, how does a leader in today's world protect themselves from this narrative hijacking where an advisor twists even positive news into a reason for resentment or conflict?
See, Shakuni's most dangerous weapon wasn't his dice. It was his ability to twist and turn reality, to curate reality. And during the Udyog Parva, as the war loomed, Krishna arrived in Hastinapur as a peace envoy, the Shanti Dut, and he brought one humble proposal saying just 5 villages to avoid a global massacre. That's how it's going to be. Now, to any objective observer, this was extreme humility. But Shakuni didn't see the facts. He saw a canvas for manipulation. And the moment you start manipulating emotions, it becomes very dangerous. The facts were practically very clear. Alongside Karna and Duryodhan, he framed his peace offering as not as a mercy, but as a strategic weakness of the Pandavas. And he pushed a narrative that the Pandavas were terrified of the Kauravas. The Kauravas had 12 lakh troops. That's 12 Aukshayani. That's a massive amount of troops compared to their about 7.5 lakhs or so. So there is total asymmetry as far as the firepower and the troops are concerned. Shakuni therefore suggested that Krishna wasn't there to negotiate, but to spy and to deceive. And he framed the narrative of the 5 village request as a trap, a foothold to dismantle the empire from within. And once the emotions started gaining momentum, Shakuni assigned a toxic motive to a peaceful act. And by framing Krishna's presence As an insult to the Kaurav's strength, he ensured and he knew that Duryodhana would react to that humiliation rather than reality. He challenged Duryodhana, how can you take Krishna at his words, etc., and that it's more of a humiliation than any. They are nowhere compared to us. And this narrative hijacking led to the disastrous attempt to even arrest Krishna, making the war inevitable. In today's corporate world, we see this Shakuni-style framing when a rival department makes a collaborative overture. A toxic advisor might whisper in the ears of the CEOs, of the HODs, VPs. They aren't offering to share resources because they want to help. They are doing it to steal our data. The facts remain the same, but the Shakuni in the room has curated the reality where help is seen as now a threat. And a striking Indian example in similar thing would be the public fallout between Bharat Pay and its co-founder Ashneer Grover. Now, beyond the legalities, the data, the facts, it became a brutal war of narratives. One side framed it as professionalizing a chaotic startup, while the other called it investors stealing a founder's baby. Shakuni-style leaders use the grapevine to frame a colleague's promotion or a new policy as an attack on the team. They don't change the facts. They change the meaning of the facts. And this creates an us versus them culture that destroys internal collaboration. And when a leader hijacks the narrative to create conflict rather than clarity, productivity is the first tragedy. Shakuni practiced that empathetic listening only to identify Duryodhana's insecurities and weaponize them. As a modern leader, our job is to use our understanding to bridge the gaps, not widen them. In fact, the senior leaders must be the chief clarity officers. In the boardroom, in the senior leadership teams, facts are the bare bones, but the narrative is the skin. If you allow someone else to curate your reality, you are no longer leading. You are being led by their insecurities. Always ask, am I reacting to what happened? Or to the intent someone else is assigned to it, or am I responding with due consideration? If you see someone framing a competitor's success as a personal insult to your team, intervene with facts. Use your influence and power to build a culture of objectivity, not a house of mirrors.
Sir, you've brought attention to how we should now move from just being C-suite leaders to becoming chief clarity officers. And in that case, I would like to ask you, how does a leader distinguish between a Shakuni style long term strategic investment and simply being stubborn about a model that isn't working? Maybe you should let go of it.
See, Shakuri's most underrated weapon was patience. And we often view the Mahabharata as a series of quick battles. But Shakuni's strategy spanned decades. And think about his commitment. He was the king of Gandhar, yet he lived as a guest in Hastinapur for most of his adult life, enduring the silent contempt of Bhishma and the suspicion of Vidur. Shakuni was just not interested in the quick wins. He understood that to dismantle a centuries old institution like the Kuru dynasty, he had to wait for his timing. He watched the princes grow from children to men, constantly, slowly planting seeds of discord. The psychological game was amazing. He was the ultimate player of the long game. Many forget that between the initial rivalry and the game of dice, the Pandavas spent years building Indraprastha. During this time also, Shakuni didn't return home. He remained in the Kuru court, becoming part of the furniture. His patience allowed the elders to lower their guard. He didn't strike when the Pandavas were weak. He waited for the moment their wealth and Duryodhana's envy intersected perfectly. Because had he struck when the Pandavas were still weak, the elders would have stepped in probably. He was invisible, but he was unstoppable. The flip side of it, the good part of this, in Indian, we have seen some Indian business also which have had this strategic patience, which is a good thing. Not because the purpose, right? I think one thing that comes to mind is the HDFC Bank's merger with HDFC Limited. It was a vision decades in the making, waiting for the perfect regulatory environment for a good cause. Conversely, failed retail giants like Carrefour tried to burn cash for quick dominance, but exited India within years. They lacked the patience to understand the Indian terrain. Another fantastic textbook example of hard power could be the Kellogg's entry and their arrogance. So they came into India I think in 1994, and they launched a crusade to convert the paratha and the poha eaters to cornflakes overnight. And they put their marketing teams into massive overdrive. They effectively insulted the Indian mothers that their traditional breakfasts were inferior. They ignored a fundamental Kuru style detail: Indian drink warm milk. Cold cornflakes in warm milk turn soggy in seconds. And much like a warrior charging into a forest without knowing the terrain, Kellogg was defeated by the Indian palate. However, Kellogg's learned the long game. They didn't exit, they adapted. They adapted a Shakuni-style adaptation in a good way, not in an evil way, but a strategic realignment. They moved a battlefield. They stopped fighting the parathas and targeted the nutrition gap in the children, localized the narrative, and they introduced even flavors which the Indian palate preferred, like kesar pista. And while this mirrors Shakuni, how Shakuni used local idioms to gain access to the Kuru mind, but they did it in a better way. Strategic patience isn't about waiting, it's about observing and adapting. Shakuni spent 30 years becoming one of them to influence them. Kellogg spent 20 years becoming Indian to win the market. So preparation is not a one-time event. Shakuni spent his life sharpening his saw, what Stephen Covey again called a sharpening the saw, becoming better and better at his game, his intellect and his dice. As a leader, use your patience to prepare, not just to plot. Be patient in strategy, but impatient in execution. If you play the long game just to settle a score, you are wasting energy. Play to build a legacy, a long-term legacy. Patience isn't about sitting idle. It's about what you do while you wait. The loudest move isn't always the strongest. Sometimes being invisible is the only way to be unstoppable.
Sir, I think this part about patience, it just reminded me of the movie Dhurandhar, where again that patience comes into play for such a long time, over decades. So we've seen the results of it again and again. What I want to ask you is about, in today's world we have a lot of startups, especially in our culture right now, and most of these companies, these startups, they are brilliant at the launch phase, where they are just entering the market, but they seem to have no plan once they launch and they've won. So why is this Shakuni style lack of a North Star so dangerous for the long term health of an Indian startup? And how can a founder shift from being a mercenary to being a steward for their legacy?
Yeah. So it's a very live example going on nowadays. Shakuni's leadership reveals a terrifying void. He had no stake in the future. Unlike Bhishma, who lived for the continuity of the Kuru line, or even Dhritarashtra, who was obsessed with his son's inheritance. Shakuni was a leader with a burn it all philosophy. He was the architect of the war, yet he did nothing to prepare the Kauravas for what would come after the victory, if at all. He had to prepare for victory also. He had not prepared them. Shakuni is seen as a man who was completely detached himself from his own kingdom of Gandhar. He didn't care if the Kuru throne was left standing on a pile of ashes, as long as the Pandavas were gone. He coached Duryodhan in the art of winning, but never in the art of ruling. And this is his ultimate failure of leadership. Having no North Star or having no clearly defined universal purpose for the good of mankind. His purpose was the immediate destruction of my rivals. Nothing beyond that. And his whole scheming thing was, how do I ensure the Pandavas fail? Shakuni won the battle of the dice and triggered the battle of Kurukshetra. But in doing so, he ensured that his own sister's entire lineage would be wiped out. Again, like what I've said, he was a king who led his followers into a graveyard. What lessons can we draw from this? In the Indian startup ecosystem, we always tout we have got some 10,000 startups, fantastic. And there's money pouring in from the angel investors, from the VCs. They have Series A, Series B, etc. But there seems to be this Shakuni-style lack of succession in the mercenary leaders. These are executives or founders who focus entirely on hyper growth at any cost to drive up the valuations for an exit. And there are high profile Indian ed tech and fintech companies that grew at breakneck speed only to collapse under the weight of poor governance and the toxic culture once the war for market share ended. And take the example of Byju's. Phenomenal growth. They were the giant at that time. What happened? These leaders win the market share battle, but they leave behind a hollow organization with no middle management, no sustainable culture, and no future. When the leader doesn't care about what happens to the organization after they leave, they aren't a leader. They are a saboteur. Shakuni's mental creation was purely negative. It was about an end that destroyed everything. As a modern leader, your end must include a succession plan which has been trained to succeed you. True leadership is measured by how well the team performs when the leader is not in the room. If your strategy involves burning the house down just to win a room, you have failed the most basic test of leadership, what is called as stewardship. Shakuni's leadership reveals a terrifying void. He had no stake in the future. He was the king who detached himself from his own kingdom to live in a rival's guest house, purely to watch it crumble. He taught Duryodhan how to grab the throne, but never how to hold it. He won the battle of the dice, but led his own sister's lineage into the graveyard. And like I said, we see this Shakuni-style mindset in many modern Muslims. Example was the recent, a couple of years ago, the housing.com bubble that came up. The leadership was obsessed with asymmetric warfare, using massive capital to humiliate legacy competitors. They said, we are the kings and everybody else is old school. They will not last. It was brilliant, aggressive, yet ultimately hollow. Like Shakuni, they operated with a burn it all philosophy. They won the PR wars and the valuation game, but ignored the art of ruling the customer, governance, and sustainable culture. And when the war for market share ended, there was no North Star or what was their purpose that was left. The organization fractured because it was coached to win, not to endure. It was pure win mentality or a win-lose mentality. They had no concept of win-win. The lesson, if your strategy requires burning every bridge and ignoring every ethical guardrail just to win a room, you aren't a founder. You're a saboteur of your own legacy. And true leadership is stewardship. Don't lead your team into a victory that leaves only ashes. Before you go ahead, I request people to please subscribe, like, and comment on what you feel. And also share this video with someone whom you feel deserves to hear this conversation.
Thank you so much, sir. So, what I want to know from the Mahabharata is that it's a world of titans. We have massive warriors, they have divine weapons, they have powers, and yet Shakuni stands out because, when you see him, he almost seems like a physically weak and frail character. How did a man who did not carry a bow or a mace, especially in a time of warriors, manage to become more dangerous than an entire army? And what does this teach us about the alpha culture in our own offices?
Shakuni is a fascinating departure from the hyper masculine warrior, the archetype of the Mahabharata. While Bhishma, Drona, and even the Pandavas defined themselves through physical strength and divine weapons, Shakuni was a king who chose to operate from the position of perceived weakness. We know that typically he was often seen as the limping, quiet figure in the background, the unarmed uncle. However, Shakuni turned this perception into his greatest shield because the Kuru elders viewed him as a non combatant and a mere relative. They drastically underestimated his strategic depth and how he had captured Duryodhana's mindset. And he weaponized this vulnerability. He allowed others to feel superior to, always told them that they are superior. I am just a small minor person, which made them drop their guard. And while the warriors were flexing their muscles and shouting challenges, Shakuni was quietly observing the psychology. He understood that in a hall full of giants, the person who appears small is the only one who watches. And that is exactly when you strike the most decisive blow. In the Indian corporate world, we see this in the rise of challenger brands that the legacy giants ignore until it's too late. One example that comes to mind is of in the earlier days of Nirma. You know, in its early days, while a multinational giant like Hindustan Lever was focusing on high-end marketing and premium distribution, Nirma's founder Kasanbhai Patel was selling detergent door to door on his bicycle. The big players underestimated the weak local competitor. And by the time they realized Nirma had captured the massive middle class Indian market, the unarmed underdog had already disrupted the industry. Modern leaders should learn that power doesn't always roar. Often, the most dangerous competitor is the one you don't consider a threat because they don't look or act like a traditional alpha. Shakuni was different from the warriors and used that difference to conquer them. As a leader, your takeaway is to look for the Shakuni in your team, the quiet person, the one with a different background, or the one who doesn't fit in the corporate mold. Don't confuse quiet with inactive. A diverse team that includes unconventional thinkers can spot the blind spots that a group of alpha leaders might miss. Leverage unique perspectives in your team to build a stronger, more resilient organization.
Sir, I think this is something that every leader should think about how we look at others, how we consider alpha leaders, and what are the signs that we might miss because of our own biases. And you made a very profound statement there that intellect without ethics is a weapon of mass destruction. And we actually see that play out in real life and in real wars as well. We see many Shakuni like brilliant strategists in the Indian corporate world who use every loophole possible to get to the top. So, how can a leader navigate this complex dice game reality of modern business without losing the integrity of Yudhishthir that ensures that the entire system actually serves a bigger purpose?
The Mahabharata concludes Shakuni's uh, this thing on the 18th day. It will last till 18th day. And after a lifetime of manipulation, he's ultimately slain by Sahadev, I think the quietest of the Pandavas, who had sworn to see through his illusions. It's a poetic end that the master of hidden strategy is defeated by the master of observation. But the real tragedy is the state of his victory. By the time Shakuni dies, his nephews are dead, his lineage is ending, and the kingdom he won is a scorched graveyard. In the Bhandarkar text and Vivek Devaraj's text, there is no celebration, only the realization that his long game resulted in total annihilation. He won the game but lost the very purpose of living. And we see this sometimes hollow victories in Indian businesses. Consider a hostile takeover driven by aggressive loopholes and mudslinging. The new team gets the CEO's chair, but the talent has resigned. The brand is in tatters and the stock is plummeting. They won the board, but they rule a graveyard. And this happens when leadership is driven by ego and resentment rather than creation of value. The customer is then forgotten. If your success destroys the ecosystem, you haven't succeeded. You just been the last one to fall. Shakuni was always reactive to past trauma. To be truly proactive, responsive, a leader must take responsibility for their own actions. Don't let an old grudge dictate your future strategy. Leadership is about abhyudaya, the welfare of all. If your organizational strategy doesn't leave the world better, you are just rolling dice in a burning house. Shakuni was a king who chose to be a permanent guest in Hastinapur, abandoning his duties as a father and ruler. He dragged his son Uluka into the war. That wasn't Gandha's fight. Many corporate leaders make similar sacrifices. They are physically present at home, but mentally living in the guest room of their office problems. As Stephen Covey said, no success can compensate for failure in the home. True leadership requires a holistic vision. If your professional victory requires the collateral damage of your family's well being, you are losing slowly. Intellect without ethics is a weapon of mass destruction. We definitely need Shakuni's intelligence to navigate systems, but we also need Yudhishthir's integrity to ensure they serve a purpose. Strategy without soul is just a game of dice, and in that game, eventually everyone loses. My final 3-point checklist for you. First one is empowerment. Does your team know what to do if I am not in the room? I always tell people that policy decisions, they must come to you. But if they are coming to you for every day for every routine decisions, then something is wrong. You are not empowering them. Sustainability is the second one. Is your growth fueled by value or by burning the house down? So are you simply going after growth at the cost of your team's health? Watch. The third, legacy. Will people remember the victory or the ashes that you leave behind? Folks, success isn't measured by the rivals you destroy, but the world you leave behind. Don't spend your life winning a game that leaves you with nothing but ashes. Do join me next Thursday at 8 p.m. as we decode the next chapter of this leadership saga, the blindness of emotional attachment and the high cost of indecision in the boardroom. Subscribe now and see you live.